In early February 1944, as the Allies pushed toward the Gustav Line, US Fifth Army headquarters circulated a grim statistical review. M3 Stuarts had suffered the highest armour loss rate of any American vehicle in Italy, while German Tiger units recorded some of their most favourable kill ratios of the war. The numbers appeared absolute. A 13-ton light tank could not meaningfully challenge a 54-ton Tiger One in open terrain. But on the morning of February 12th, near the terraces above the Liri Valley, that assumption met its breaking point. 6 Tigers from Schwerpanzerabteilung 508 advanced along a fog-covered route believed completely secure from light armour interference. What they encountered instead was a lone M3 Stuart whose crew had spent months studying German movement patterns, gearbox lag and turret traverse limitations. Their next 17 minutes would become one of the most dissected small unit engagements of the entire Italian campaign. On most days, the Stuart would have done what Doctrine now expected of it. It would have reversed out of sight, called in a contact report over its SCR 508 radio, signal corps radio, and waited for artillery or medium armour to shoulder the responsibility. Instead, as the first orange flashes from German muzzle brakes flickered in the mist, and the first high-velocity rounds began their long arcs into the valley, the light tank lurched into motion. Rather than backing away from the ridgeline, it rolled over it, dropping down the slope toward the Tigers, its driver forcing the transmission into a sequence of shifts and brake taps no manual had ever described. What followed would last just 17 minutes on a single Italian hillside. Yet for officers who later reconstructed those minutes on maps and test ranges, that short, violent run would mark the moment when one of the least respected tanks in the Allied infantry demonstrated that weight and calibre did not always have the final word. By the time Tigers were grinding up Italian mountain roads in 1944, their legend had already been written elsewhere. On the Eastern Front, they had frontally shrugged off early Soviet guns. In Tunisia, they had outranged the first Shermans to arrive in North Africa. The design embodied a simple equation. More armour, more gun, more psychological weight. With frontal plates up to 100 mm thick, well-sloped side armour, and the 88 mm K-36 main gun derived from a proven anti-aircraft weapon, the Tiger was built to dictate range and terms. German training films and field manuals reinforced the point. Crews were taught to fight from hull-down positions, to seek long sight lines, and to engage at distances where the enemy's fire could not meaningfully answer back. Opposite that giant stood the M3 Stuart, a product of an earlier moment in American armoured thinking. When it first entered service in 1941, a fast light tank with a 37mm M6 gun seemed adequate for reconnaissance and exploitation roles. The Stuart's Continental radial engine, compact hull, and 5-speed synchromesh transmission gave it excellent acceleration on roads and farm tracks. Its narrow tracks and relatively low ground pressure let it move across soft ground that would bog heavier vehicles. On paper, it was a cavalryman's machine, meant to see without being seen, and to slip away from danger rather than absorb it. War in Europe stripped that concept down to harsh arithmetic. By the time Allied units were fighting through Sicily and into mainland Italy, the Stuart's tall silhouette and thin armour turned it into an easy aiming point whenever German anti-tank guns or heavier panzers had a clear field of fire. Reports from Salerno, the Volturno crossings, and the early battles around Cassino all carried similar lines. Light tanks destroyed in exposed positions, their 37 mm shots bouncing harmlessly off better protected opponents. Crews learned the lesson quickly. Many began to see their role less as armoured fighters and more as moving observation posts, expected to survive long enough to hand off coordinates to artillery and heavier tanks. Training pamphlets and tactical circulars reflected that shift. Emphasis fell on reconnaissance, withdrawal, and avoiding decisive contact with heavy armour. Gunnery drills continued, but few Stuart commanders believed their main gun could do more than harass a Tiger or Panther. Among German tankers, the language grew steadily more dismissive. American light tanks were toys, tin cans, targets that burned brightly and briefly. Yet buried inside the Stuart's unflattering reputation were technical traits that did not fit that caricature. Low mass, quick directional response, and a power-to-weight ratio that, in the right hands and on the right ground, could be turned from a survival tool into a weapon. All that was missing was a crew willing to stop thinking like victims of the equation and start treating it as something they could change. By the winter of 1944, long before that February morning above the Liri Valley, the Stuart's battlefield reputation had already begun to falter under the strain of hard numbers. Reports from Salerno showed light tanks disappearing in orchards and vineyards where the ground offered little resistance to German 75mm and 88mm fire. Near the approaches to Monte Cassino, several reconnaissance troops were reduced to half strength after attempting to cross open fields that German gunners had zeroed in advance. None of this surprised Allied analysts. The Stuart had not been designed to survive the kind of frontal duels the Italian campaign forced upon it, and every week seemed to produce new evidence that the small tank could no longer play the roles assigned to it in pre-war doctrine. Yet buried in those casualty lists was a pattern that only the men closest to the vehicles seemed to notice. When an M3 survived contact with heavier armour, it was seldom because of armour or gunnery. It was because the crew had found a fold in the terrain that let them slip sideways, or had taken a farm track that forced a panther or tiger to pivot before it could aim, or had used a moment of confusion to reposition faster than German optics could reacquire them. Mechanics attempting to repair battered Stuarts often found scorched grass and churned mud clinging to the tracks, in ways that suggested sharp, rapid directional changes made under intense pressure. Drivers would quietly admit to unorthodox gear shifts or brake taps they had used in desperation, improvisations that no manual encouraged, but that had bought them the seconds they needed to escape. In one armoured reconnaissance troop attached to the 1st Armoured Division, these small observations began to coalesce into something more deliberate. Crews returning from patrols talked less about the hopelessness of fighting tigers and more about the few moments when they had seen those giants struggle, slow turret traverses on slopes, difficulty maintaining aim when forced to pivot, hesitation when the ground forced them into tight angles. Maps spread over ration boxes began to carry new marks. Not just enemy gun positions, but places where the ground broke sharply, or where tree lines limited long-range fire, or where a light tank's tight turning radius might matter more than its lack of armour. Slowly, the question within the troop shifted. Instead of asking how to avoid German heavy armour, some began asking how close they could get without presenting a clean shot. The Stuart's power-to-weight ratio, listed prosaically in technical manuals, now looked like a weapon of its own. Not a way to outrun trouble on straight roads, but a way to break the geometry of a battlefield long built around the strengths of heavy tanks. By January 1944, even before the Liri Valley fight, this troop's maps no longer resembled standard reconnaissance charts. They looked more like diagrams of movement, angle and timing. Blueprints for a fight no one had yet been ordered to attempt, but one that some crews increasingly believed might be their only path to survival, once retreat or radio reports were no longer options. If you're enjoying this story, hit like, share it with someone who also loves hidden chapters of history, and subscribe for more hidden stories of World War II, and after you finish the documentary, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take. From a distance, the Stuart's charge down the hillside would later appear impulsive, even reckless, but every jarring pivot and lurching skid on that February morning drew from weeks of focused experimentation in quiet corners of the Italian countryside. South of Naples, in the lull between operations, the same crew had begun pushing their M3's mechanical limits, not out of defiance, but out of a growing sense that they would eventually face a situation in which conventional manoeuvring would not be enough. They had no special tools, no advanced engineering guidance, only a willingness to treat their tank not as a fragile reconnaissance vehicle, but as a machine with latent performance their manuals had never emphasized. It was the Stuart's 5-speed synchromesh transmission that first caught their attention. Most crews treated it cautiously, shifting along predictable sequences meant to preserve engine and track life. But the driver, who had grown up racing battered farm vehicles across uneven ground, understood instinctively that a gearbox could do more than deliver speed. It could deliver angles. He began experimenting with rapid double clutching, testing how far the hull would rotate if a brake tap was timed perfectly between shifts. At first, the results were erratic, sharp jolts that alarmed the turret crew and left mechanics shaking their heads at worn teeth and stretched track pins. Yet on soft, uneven ground, the tank reacted differently. Instead of gripping firmly and following the hull, the track slid just enough to allow a controlled swing, a sideways drift that preserved forward motion while altering the Stuart's profile in an instant. No manual recommended such treatment. The manoeuvre strained the transmission, heated the brakes, and risked derailing a track if performed too aggressively. But it produced something German doctrine had never prepared for. A moving target that could alter its lateral position faster than a Tiger turret could traverse, even under hydraulic power. On the ridge above the Liry Valley, when the first Tiger settled into a firing stance at several hundred meters, that hard-earned trick became the crew's only real armour. The Stuart surged downhill, then snapped violently to the side as the driver executed the manoeuvre with the same practiced rhythm he had drilled for weeks. The 80 cm round tore through the space the tank had occupied a heartbeat earlier, its crack echoing across the valley. The light tank pressed on, not in a straight descent, but in a constantly shifting path that prevented the German gunners from establishing the stable firing solution their doctrine required. By the time the Stuart closed to a range where its own gun could matter, the German formation was already reacting. Not with the calm precision of long-range engagement, but with the hurried corrections of men chasing a target that refused to follow the rules they had trained for. And in those fleeting moments of confusion, the balance of the battle began to tilt. The valley below became a shifting lattice of angles and distances the moment the Stuart crossed the ridgeline, transforming the fight from a contest of armour thickness into a contest of timing. Closing the range to a Tiger was usually an invitation to be annihilated, but the crew understood that if they stayed at a distance, they would die with the same predictability that had claimed dozens of other light tanks that month. Only inside a narrow band, far closer than doctrine allowed, could the Stuart's agility begin to matter. As the light tank zigzagged down the slope, the German formation attempted to impose order on the chaos, spreading slightly to keep overlapping fields of fire. Their optics and gun crews were trained for long-range dominance, not for tracking a rapidly shifting silhouette that refused to move in straight lines. The first Tiger to falter did so without taking a single penetrating hit. When the Stuart's 37mm gun barked at roughly 600 meters, the round struck not armour but the vulnerable external periscope cluster. Shattered glass and torn brackets left the German commander effectively blind. Forced to rely on secondary ports, the crew lost their situational awareness at the worst possible moment. Meanwhile, the Stuart was already veering away, the driver wrenching the hull into another abrupt lateral shift that forced the next German gunner to reacquire the target from scratch. At 400 meters, the geometry tightened further. The Germans could sense the danger now. The second Tiger attempted to pivot for a better angle, but the Stuart's driver anticipated it, plunging into another gear-assisted drift. The next high-velocity round tore into the earth where the tank had been seconds before. The return fire from the Stuart came in a short, disciplined burst. 3 armour-piercing rounds that walked along the Tiger's exposed right track. One struck precisely at the junction of the drive sprocket and track linkages. Snapping metal hardened for entirely different stresses. The massive tank jolted, sagged, and then lurched to a stop, its mobility destroyed even though its armour remained intact. The remaining Tigers were now in a fight they had not trained for. Their carefully staggered formation collapsed into a series of individual duels as the Stuart darted unpredictably across the valley. One attempted to reverse downslope and maintain distance, only to slide partially into a drainage ditch where its weight became an anchor. Another, deprived of clear sightlines by its damaged optics, withdrew behind a low rise, effectively removing itself from the fight. None of the Stuart's hits pierced frontal armour. None struck a turret ring or ammunition rack. Yet each one, delivered at the precise angle and moment the geometry allowed, stripped away a critical German advantage. Track snapped, vision vanished, guns slewed toward empty air while the light tank repositioned again. When the smoke finally thinned, 6 Tigers along that approach route were either immobile, blinded, or abandoned. Some would be finished by Allied artillery now able to range them precisely. Others would simply be left behind as German infantry withdrew in search of firmer ground. And on that hillside, an equation that had seemed immutable, light tank versus heavy tank, speed versus armour, briefly inverted itself, revealing a battlefield defined not by mass alone, but by how quickly a crew could rewrite the assumptions of those who hunted them. What unfolded on the Liry slope looked, to many infantrymen watching from shattered farmhouses, like nothing more than blind luck, an improbable dance in which a small tank had simply lived long enough to harass a much larger force. But when officers reconstructed the engagement on maps and test tracks in the weeks that followed, the pattern that emerged was neither accidental nor mystical. It was mathematical. Every hit, every near miss, every abrupt course change correlated with known limitations in German heavy armour design and doctrine. German manuals assumed that engagements would occur at distances between 800 and 2,000 metres, where optics, armour and firepower reinforced each other. At those ranges, a Tiger's strength stacked into a nearly unbreakable wall, long-range accuracy, thick frontal plates, and a crew trained to destroy targets before the enemy's gun could matter. But inside 500 metres, the battlefield changed shape. A Tiger turret powered by hydraulics could traverse quickly in ideal conditions, but on uneven ground or when fine adjustments were needed, crews often relied on the manual crank. In that mode, a full rotation could take half a minute or more. A light tank altering lateral position every few seconds did not need superior firepower. It only needed to stay out of the narrow window in which that heavy gun could bring its weight to bear. Analysts at workshops near Anzio used chalk lines on concrete to illustrate how the Stuart's abrupt skids created short-lived opportunities, gaps of 3 to 5 seconds where the Tiger's turret lagged behind the tank's movement. Within those fractions of time, a 37mm gun, aimed with care, could strike elements that German armour did not protect as heavily. Track links, sprocket teeth, periscopes, sight housings, radio aerials. These hits did not destroy a Tiger in the traditional sense, but they rendered it unable to fight forward. A mobility kill or vision kill meant a stationary target, and a stationary target meant artillery or air support could finish what the light tank had started. Training circulars drafted after the engagement shifted tone sharply. Light tanks were no longer instructed merely to spot, report and survive. Instead, they were encouraged to exploit terrain irregularities, to force turret over rotation, to create movement patterns that disrupted German rhythm. The circulars did not promise that an M3 could win a duel, but they made clear that a duel was unnecessary. Victory came from denying the enemy the range at which his strengths mattered, even if doing so required operating inside what earlier doctrines had labelled suicidal distances. By late March, officers reviewing the Leary action no longer spoke of it as an anomaly. They treated it as a case study in how battlefield assumptions collapse when confronted with a crew willing to treat the numbers not as fate, but as a puzzle. And from those numbers, a new idea emerged, one that would soon reshape how light armour fought across the Italian front and beyond. In the days immediately after the Leary Valley engagement, stories of the Stuart's run spread through Allied armoured units, with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. At first, many treated the account as a battlefield exaggeration, another tale stretched by adrenaline and foggy memory. But the after-action sketches, the damaged German vehicles left behind, and the corroborating artillery logs all pointed to the same conclusion. A light tank had not merely survived contact with Tigers, it had changed the terms of engagement so radically that the heavier formation lost its cohesion. Once the reports were circulated formally, the event stopped being a rumour and began its transition into training doctrine. Stuart crews across Italy started taking a closer look at their own transmissions, suspensions and brakes. Mechanics, initially sceptical, watched as drivers demonstrated the timing required for the controlled drifts and lateral pivots that had baffled the Tigers. Each manoeuvre came at a mechanical cost: overheated brakes, worn clutch plates, track links pushed to their limits. Yet the underlying principle was too compelling to ignore. Instructors revised battlefield briefings, emphasizing that while light tanks could not win a frontal contest, they could force heavy armour into a fight that stripped away the very advantages German doctrine depended on, and if executed on ground that favoured unpredictable movement, speed could be weaponized as effectively as firepower. Reconnaissance patrols, once instructed to disengage immediately at the sight of heavy armour, were now given more nuanced directives. They were told to probe, to identify angles, to evaluate terrain not just for concealment, but for how it could be used to undermine turret traverse and limit line of sight. They mapped abrupt inclines, irrigation ditches, narrow terraces, and patches of soft earth where a Tiger's weight became a liability. This shift in thinking marked a significant psychological turning point for Allied light tank crews. Instead of viewing Tigers as unstoppable predators, they began seeing them as machines with heavy, measurable constraints. German forces sensed the shift as well. Intelligence summaries from early 1944 show that heavy tank battalions were instructed to avoid moving without close infantry support in areas where maneuver space was limited. Wider spacing between tanks was mandated to reduce the risk of simultaneous harassment. Commanders were cautioned against assuming dominance at short range, where their traverse rate could be exploited. These changes slowed German armoured movements and disrupted the tempo that had previously allowed Tigers to dictate the pace of engagements. Even on days when no Stuart appeared, the possibility shaped German behaviour. Heavy crews advanced more cautiously, scanning gullies and terraces with an attention they had not needed earlier in the campaign. They hesitated before cresting ridges or entering narrow fields. The very terrain that once seemed harmless now felt threatening. The Stuart, still technically obsolete by the standards of 1944, had begun imposing a strategic footprint far larger than its silhouette. The lesson was clear. A tank dismissed as a tin can could alter the behaviour of giants by proving that certain assumptions, once accepted as immutable, were in fact vulnerabilities waiting to be pressed. The M3 Stuart would never claim the spotlight in post-war histories the way the Tiger, Panther or Sherman Firefly would. Its armour remained thin, its gun remained small, and its silhouette remained a reminder of early war design. By late 1944, new vehicles were already lined up to replace it, built with heavier guns and more robust armour to counter the escalating demands of European combat. Yet the leery engagement ensured that the Stuart's legacy would not be measured solely by the thickness of its plates or the diameter of its barrel. Instead, it lived on through a set of insights that reshaped how military planners thought about light armour, long after the guns of the Italian front fell silent. Post-war design committees combed through mountains of combat data from Italy, France and the Eastern Front. Again and again, they circled the same takeaway. Mobility without doctrine was survival by chance, but mobility applied deliberately, toward known weaknesses in heavier vehicles, could transform a reconnaissance platform into a precision tool. Engineers studying turret dynamics, power-to-weight ratios, and mechanical responsiveness folded those insights into new projects. When the M41 Walker Bulldog entered service in the early 1950s, its 500 horsepower engine and emphasis on rapid maneuverability were direct descendants of the lessons wrung from that February hillside. Soviet designers reached similar conclusions. Intelligence reports exchanged across continents noted the growing importance of mobility as a tactical equalizer. The T-54 and T-55, though medium tanks, adopted unusually high power-to-weight ratios for their class. Their doctrine emphasized rapid, close-range maneuvering as a means of overwhelming enemy armor that relied too heavily on long-range engagement. The battlefield had changed, but the principle was the same. The side that understood how to bend the geometry of a fight often dictated its outcome. For the men who had fought in the valleys and ridges of Italy, the legacy felt more personal. Infantry who once pitied the Stuart as a vulnerable scout now remembered it as the unlikely machine that stood between them and the armoured spearheads advancing through the winter fields. Mechanics who had worked through long nights repairing cracked housings and worn gear teeth could look back, knowing that those efforts fed into a breakthrough far larger than a single battle. And the crew, whose tank had carved unpredictable arcs through the Liri Valley, carried the memory quietly, knowing that their willingness to challenge established assumptions had altered not just the flow of a single engagement, but the wider understanding of how light armour could be used. The snow would eventually melt from the terraces above the valley. The wrecks would be dragged away, fields replanted, and new machines would take the place of the old. Yet the idea that emerged from that brief violent run, that agility, timing, and perspective could upend the expectations of overwhelming force, remained, echoing each time a commander weighed not just what a machine was built to do, but what it might do when pushed beyond the boundaries others had accepted for it.